And where did you go from there? I mean, once that book came out, where was your research
Well,
heading?
once that book came out, there was, well, for a while I became, and at this point I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit it, I became a number cruncher. I became a quantitative historian because the lack of archives meant that, you know, there really wasn't a huge material source base that we could work on. So for a while I worked on collecting biographies of dead Bolsheviks to try to statistically figure out who survived and who didn't. That was rudely interrupted, happily interrupted, by the archival explosion beginning in the late 1980s, and that changed everything.
So you let go of that, or were there findings from that research that?
There were a couple of findings, findings that predictably in American Sovietology were generally ignored. I worked on this, by the way, in partnership with William Chase, the Soviet Data Bank project, it was called. We found out that statistically speaking, old Bolsheviks, those who had been in the party before 1917, were not at risk any more than anybody else. That was a statistical correlation that didn't hold up. The correlation that did hold up was the higher your rank in 1937, the more exposed you were. It was largely a purge of the elite, where what you were doing at the time, 36, 37, was much more important than who you were generically.
And then the archives opened.
Then the archives
Where did you go? What was your first impulse?
Well, you know, they opened by bits and and fits and starts, I guess you would say. At the end of the 80s, we were already getting into the State Archive. At that time, it was called the Central State Archive of the October Revolution. And I worked in there a little bit on non-party things, constitutions, elections, organizations of Soviets, while at the same time knocking on the door of the Communist Party archive every single day. Actually, I have been knocking on the door of that archive for about 15 years with a different set of letters of recommendation every time and the same frowning, shaking head sending me away every time. And then suddenly, in 1990, the leadership of that archive changed dramatically. And a lot of it is being in the right place at the right time. I had for a long time been friends and colleagues with some of the junior archivists who worked in the party archive. Even with their intercession, I hadn't been able to get in. And then suddenly in 1990, everybody above them was fired by the Yeltsin people as part of a political purge of the communists. So my old friends were suddenly running the place.
Very helpful.
And that, more than anything else, got me in and got me a start.
So there you are in the party archives.
Mm-hmm.
What are the first files that you open? What are the things that you're looking at? And is there a strategy that you're bringing in? I mean, you've obviously had 15 years you're trying to get into it.
Mm.
There must have been quite a strong
Well, it was
strategy.
hard at first because I had no idea how the archive was organized. You know, I had worked in Origins of the Great Purges and partly a kind of central periphery motif, the relations between Moscow and this particular province, Smolensk. So I marched into the party archive the first day I was there, and I said, well, I want to see all the correspondence between Moscow and Smolensk. Well, the archive's not organized that way. There's not a file of correspondence. There are some papers here and some papers there and some papers. It takes months to even figure out where to look for what's an obvious theme for me. It's not the way the archives are organized. The first thing I grabbed, though, that I knew exactly was the transcript of the February Central Committee plenum of 1937. Which was one of the texts in which Stalin and others participated in sort of formulating the terror that would follow in 1937. And I learned something really interesting with that. One of my friends brought it to me, and you know, I was breathless. There was in front of me on my desk this transcript of this meeting that I'd only dreamed about. And you know, when I caught my breath, I opened the file and started reading it, and there were big chunks of it missing. And I thought, well, why is some of this missing? In fact, the part I really wanted to see, the interrogation of oppositionist Bukharin, wasn't there. And the transcript I had, the meeting seemed to have begun on February 27th, and I knew it had begun on the 24th. But here was a text that bore no relation to what I knew reality to be. That got me interested in the whole question of variant texts, what got saved and why. As it turned out, this was a text prepared for a certain level of party worker in the 1930s who they didn't want to see the interrogation of Bukhar. And so they created an entire variant minutes, a text of the meeting. Finally, with some pushing and prodding, I got the other part. But, and this is one of the themes that got me into my most recent book, Road to Terror. Variant texts of the same event were created by different party entities for different purposes. Some people had the right to know more than others. Some people had the right to create texts. And the creation of texts is in fact political power.
I can see that has an enormous influence on Road to Terror, but I wonder whether I can bring you back to the early 1990s and get you to talk a bit about the second book and all the other things that you were reading there and how your image of not only the terror was evolving, but your image of Soviet politics in the 1930s was evolving.
Well, you know, when I wrote the first book, Road to Terror, as I said, I didn't have access to archives. I had this kind of crummy, confused Smolensk archive and press that had to be read in a truly Aesopian way to figure out what's going on there. So I had to guess about a lot of things. A lot of things in Road to Terror seemed highly reasonable and logical and probable. Turned out when the archives opened, I'd been wrong about some stuff. I had been wrong basically about the relations between local party and police agencies, for example.
Can you be more specific about?
Yeah, I had argued in Road to Terror, the way it seemed to me, was that the local Communist Party organizations and the local secret police organizations didn't really work together very much. That the party purged the party and the police went after other kinds of dissidents, and they really didn't connect very much. What I found out was that they connected a lot. But the story, even though I was wrong, I was happy because the story was even more interesting than I could have imagined. The story is that they were competing with each other and defaming each other and arguing about who was really the enemy and who wasn't the enemy. And the party would purge people and the police would let them go. Or the police would purge people and the party would let them go. That you had something that I always liked to find but found rarely, institutional conflict under Stalinism. That's probably the most exciting thing the archives did for me.
Isn't there? Surely there's a strong sense of institutional conflict in Origins, though.
But I was guessing at it. I was guessing at it. With Origins, well, on the question of institutional conflict, it was a little bit like a kabuki play. I mean, I could see the shadows behind the screen and sort of guess what they were doing to each other, but that's not any substitute at all for actually seeing the actors.
One of the things that your critics have observed was that you pushed very hard the idea that there was a group of radicals and a group of moderates that were struggling for Stalin's ear in the 1930s. Were you, at some point, were you exploring that issue in your research in the early 1990s, once the archives opened?
I was exploring that, and what I found really wasn't what I had guessed at before or expected to find. I had imagined in Origins, and again, looking at the kabuki play in the shadows, I had imagined that there were fairly well-defined groups of radicals and fairly well-defined groups of moderates in the leadership, pushing policy toward or away from repression or toward or away from reconciliation. What I found out in the archive was that these groups didn't exist as kind of stable political ideological factions. People were, in fact, radical or moderate, but it was tied to the organization they were running. In other words, we find fairly consistently that people associated with the police, judicial, punitive type organizations are hardliners about repression. We find, on the other hand, people who are trying to make the trains run on time are much less excited about arresting a lot of talented people. So yes, there were radicals and moderates, but it was tied not to ideological predilection, but to the jobs they were trying to do at the time.
And how does that help us then explain the zigs and zags of policy, how there isn't a consistent story of Stalin sort of perfecting his personal dictatorship?
Well, I'm not sure we can rule out a consistent story of Stalin perfecting his dictatorship, but he did it in ways that were a lot more subtle than we were used to thinking.